Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Washington meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday to present him with a four-point, quote, victory plan that the Ukrainian leader said will force Russia to the negotiating table. As of our recording, the exact details of the plan have not been made public, but the head of the Ukrainian presidential administration, Andriy Yermak, said that it included an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. Zelensky said last week that the plan also included U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine, the delivery of more advanced weapons, and the use of Kursk as a bargaining chip in negotiations with Russia. The Ukrainian president wants the plan to be implemented before Biden leaves office early next year in case of a Trump victory in November. This came one day after Donald Trump railed against Zelensky at a speech in North Carolina for refusing to strike a deal to end the war. Walter, news or faux news?
Honestly, I think it's kind of faux news. It looks to me like the peace plan itself, again, the little that we can tell, is basically a rehash of everything Ukraine has ever said that it wants. So in that sense, the Ukrainian peace plan is for the United States to give the Ukraine a bunch of stuff to bomb Russia with or attack Russia with, and also let us in NATO. These are basically the Ukrainian peace goals, repackaged as a victory plan. And we're reading that the Biden people aren't that impressed with the plan. They've never actually been very impressed with Ukraine's chances of victory, even more so after the failure of the counteroffensive of last year. What this is telling us is that as the election is getting closer and as the Russians are continuing to grind away in the east of the country, Zelensky is getting more nervous, feels the need to try some things and get some headlines, hoping to stir up some support in the West, but so far does not seem to be getting the reaction that he needs.
I guess somewhat related, there was also a report this week that Vladimir Putin said he plans to lower the threshold for Russia's use of nuclear weapons. I think he basically said that an attack of conventional weapons on Russian territory is now grounds for nuclear retaliation. Where do you put the credibility of these intermittent nuclear threats from Putin 2.5 years now into the war?
It's same old, same old. The logic of deterrence is still there. Putin has to worry that if he lobs a nuclear missile at a bomb at a NATO state, NATO will retaliate in kind. That's a path nobody really wants to go down. And so far, ever since 1949, when for the first time you had two nuclear powers, that's been enough to keep anybody from going down that road. I don't see that logic as having changed in the last 6 weeks. But what Putin does know is that the people in the West no longer, the leadership by and large is sort of weaker and less experienced than it was with this kind of blackmail during the Cold War. So he may hope that there's some idiot out there that will be persuaded by this rhetoric, and it's not impossible that there is. I can think in Germany and the United States of some people who might fall into that category. Also, I imagine he sees fear of war as one of the driving forces that weakens support for the war, for Ukraine, both in Europe and the United States. So for him, this is a no-brainer. It's a move that costs him nothing, commits him to nothing, offers him no real backlash. It doesn't have any downside for him. And who knows, might even do something positive.
All right, our second story. For the first time in modern American history, young men are now more religious than their female peers. They attend services more often and are more likely to identify as religious. Among Gen Z Christians, this dynamic is playing out in a stark way. The men are staying in church while the women are leaving at a remarkable clip. Church membership has been dropping in the United States for years, but within Gen Z, almost 40% of women now describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated, compared with 34% of men, according to a survey by the American Enterprise Institute. In every other age group, men were much more likely to be unaffiliated. According to the Wall Street Journal, this growing gender divide has the potential to reshape the landscape of not just religion, but also of family life and politics. Walter, news or faux news?
And this looks a bit like news to me. Both that women are leaving and men are staying, or in some cases, signing up. It's particularly interesting because this comes after what, a half century where the mainline churches, Protestant churches, and to some degree the Catholic Church have made reaching out to women a priority. So liturgies have been rewritten in a way that take out. I think God is sort of the only being in the universe that can't have preferred pronouns, and you've got sort of trying to move away theologically from sky father God to earth mother God, or all kinds of different things, and it seems to be coming up pretty empty. Now, is that because you know, you would think, if anything, that would mean that more women would be going to church and the men would be skedaddling. But what you see, I think, is that the men are actually. My guess is, if you looked a little bit deeper into those numbers, you'd see that the men are going to more conservative churches that haven't adopted a more feminist take on theology. So it's very interesting. I think it's likely to me that, as I look ahead at the kind of stormy world we're about to move into, where the international situation gets more dangerous, where the domestic economy is, has more ups and downs with it, and sort of HR departments kind of are losing a bit of their hold. We may be seeing a kind of a shift from an era of sort of that was basically favorable to female accomplishment, female fulfillment in a way, and looking into an era where some of the more traditionally male qualities, physical bravery on the battlefield, to comfort with a unpredictable work environment or work situation. Now, I'm not trying to say that, men are inherently better at these things than women are, or that no women can do X or Y. This is not at all where I'm trying to go with this. But just to say, it's been a woman's world in some ways, in upper middle class American life, at least for quite a while. Maybe maybe there's a sense that this is about to change. We're certainly seeing a kind of young male rebellion against sort of the rule of the widow Douglas, in Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer in Huckleberry Finn, lady that took Huck Finn in and wanted to civilize him and make him eat with a knife and fork and observe all these, manners and so on. And Huck didn't want to do it. He ran away, and he just couldn't wait to get kind of out where those rules didn't work. I think we are getting a bit of that. The tech world, to some degree, has been a place where that was happening, where it's a new industry. You have all these startups. An HR department is not the first thing with a bunch of policy rules and DEI initiatives. And that's not the first thing a startup firm wants to make sure that has a really, really big HR component. So it's been a bit more of the wild frontier. And I think maybe we're moving into a more frontier mode. Now, there's also an aspect of it where there are just certain elements of modernity that men find more challenging than women do. And the reality that women, as opposed to past centuries, women don't die disproportionately in childbirth, and economic success doesn't depend on the kind of upper body muscle strength and so on, where men tend to exceed women. So that women have had, and I think will continue to have, greater power, greater access, greater economic independence than they've had in the past. So something fundamental has changed in the relationship of the sexes, not to mention what things like birth control and abortion, whatever you may or may not think about these things as whether they're good or not, but just as realities, they give women much more control over their reproductive cycles, their reproductive lives. So women are in a different position than they used to be. In some ways, that makes life better for men. I hope my brother and my sister-in-law will forgive me if I talk about when my brother was decided it was time to really settle down and find a great wife. He described his fantasy bride as an old, sweet, old-fashioned girl who loved me, loved my children, and make $250,000 a year. So amazingly, he found her, and she's wonderful. In case she's watching, seriously. So women are in a different position. Men, in some ways, are having to adjust to a world in which some things that men long took for granted are no longer true. But I think the sort of death of men has been, and the death of the masculine as some sort of, I think that's been proclaimed a little bit prematurely, and that we may be seeing some kind of a renaissance of male drive, male ambition. How that takes shape, whether it's positive or negative at times, I'm sure it will be both, will be interesting to see. But I would say this is one of those straws in the wind that tells us that something out there really is happening.
All right, final story of the week. US UK airstrikes in Yemen designed to end the Houthi disruption of commercial shipping have not seriously degraded the group's military capability, the vice chair of the UN recognized government in Yemen has said, calling for a change to a better coordinated strategy between the West, the region, and the Yemeni government. He said it was time to accept that the Houthis were not interested in a power sharing deal in the country and that, quote, the airstrikes, instead of deterring the Houthis, are having the opposite effect. In a way, it is helping them and making them stronger, because the local popular perception is that the Houthis occupy the high ground by mobilizing people around the idea that they're being attacked by the US but are mounting an effective defense, close quote. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, it's not exactly news because anybody who didn't know this already hasn't been paying attention. The complete flop of American policy in keeping the Red Sea closed is something that the Biden administration is going to have to live with as a big, ugly black mark on its record forever. It is weak, it is foolish, it is self-defeating, it makes a bad situation worse. And it's hard for me to think of an American president who would have been, maybe since the time of James Buchanan, who would have been so ineffective in trying to cope with such a significant challenge. That said, I'm sure that the president of the government of Yemen feels that lots more American money sent to his government with no questions asked would really be the best way to solve this problem, or at least to put it on a more positive footing. So I think he's absolutely right that there's a big problem. I am not so sure that his own pet solution is the way out. I tend to think this is something where Iran has more control than anybody in Yemen.
Speaking of that, there was just one more related news item there I saw, which is that Iran is now apparently brokering secret or used to be secret talks between Russia and the Houthi leadership to transfer anti-ship missiles to them. What's your impression of the current status of the Russian-Iranian partnership? I mean, we've heard for years mostly fears of Sino-Russian cooperation, but it seems the Russian-Iranian relationship is really hitting us where it hurts right now.
Well, Jeremy, that cannot possibly be true. We all know that Iran has elected a reform-minded president who was interested in diplomacy. And indeed, he was just at the United Nations talking about Iran's deep desire for negotiation and peace. Lucy really wants Charlie Brown to take another run at the football, and she's very sincere. So I think it's really small-minded and petty of you not to take his kind words and his genuine desire for diplomacy at their face value. When people, so many people have thought about Putin's retaliation against Western policy in Ukraine simply at the level of military escalation in Ukraine and stay up at night worrying about nuclear weapons exchanges. This is a much more effective and much more likely and lower risk and lower cost way for Putin to escalate. And I think, again, the United States really needs to take Iran out of this equation. and Iran needs to feel that this sort of behavior is not only unacceptable to us, but it provokes reactions from us that make it unacceptable to Iran.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So on Wednesday, Walter, the US, its allies in Europe, and several Arab countries unveiled a joint ceasefire proposal to end the recent deadly fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. In a statement, all the signatories called for, quote, an immediate 21-day ceasefire across the Lebanon-Israel border to provide space for further negotiations. The office of Benjamin Netanyahu quickly responded that, quote, the news about a ceasefire is not true. This is an American-French proposal to which the prime minister did not respond, close quote. Israel Katz, the foreign minister, concurred that, quote, there will be no ceasefire in the north. A day earlier, Walter, you'd written a column about Biden's diplomatic magical thinking, as you called it, that was about an administration more devoted than any other to diplomacy in the Middle East, and yet which has maybe racked up more diplomatic failures there than perhaps any other. Tell us what it is exactly that the president and his senior national security team don't seem to understand still about how effective diplomacy works, assuming we're taking their sincerity in this area at face value.
Well, I think in some ways it really does go back to the lessons that President, then Senator Biden learned from the Vietnam War, that the United States had committed 500,000 troops to the Vietnam War, untold casualties, 50,000 American casualties. No one really knows the number of people killed in Vietnam. Huge costs politically to America's social fabric, political cohesion, cost to America's standing in the world, big financial costs, and we're obviously still today paying costs of disabled veterans and other kinds. The final bill for the Vietnam War has not yet been totaled up. Coming out of that scalding experience, a generation of Democratic policy thinkers asked, well, why did we get into this mess? And they said, well, it's because we thought that the military was the tool that you could settle everything with. And that if you just sent enough soldiers and so on, you would be able to sort things out. Well, they said, we got it. That's terrible thinking. That is the wrong kind of thinking. And really what we've got to do is become less military in our posture and more oriented toward diplomacy. And diplomacy is the answer. And it's got to be patient diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't work overnight, doesn't work by getting you everything you want. But if we had done better diplomacy, maybe we wouldn't have seen all these casualties. And the worst thing about diplomacy is that if in the end it fails and you've got to have a war, well, you put it off for a while, even if you didn't prevent it. And I think we see that thinking. Biden was beginning to edge out of it in the 80s and 90s because the interventions in Grenada under Reagan and then Clinton in Yugoslavia seemed to be working, and American power projection looked good. So when the U.S. and Biden, who had opposed George H.W. Bush's move in the Gulf War, then ended up supporting the Iraq War. When the Iraq War did not turn out to be exactly what he wanted, I think for Biden, his youthful convictions came back on him. And since then, we've seen Biden as consistently someone who is among the most dovish of Democratic policymakers. And he has been very much aligned with someone like John Kerry, whose Vietnam experience was very similar. One of the costs, by the way, of poorly planned and executed wars is you then get a generation of bad foreign policy thinking by people who are drawing simplistic and incorrect lessons from a really complex set of problems. I think, what is actually true is that neither diplomacy nor military force is some magic force that if you just unleash enough of it, you will get what you want. You have to come back to what Clausewitz, the German writer on war, said, that war, is an extension of politics by other means. Now, what that really means is that You can fight all you want, but the point of a war is to achieve some kind of a political goal. And if your political goal is unachievable, it doesn't matter how many soldiers you send to how many battlefronts, you're not going to get it. But I think in the same way, this is true of diplomats too. Diplomacy is a political tool for a political end. And if you don't have a viable political goal in mind, you can't kind of build a diplomatic structure that will, that will support something that is too contradictory or too weak to exist on its own. The president's diplomacy in the Middle East has been, I think, based on trying to preserve the structure of the modern Middle East, which in a lot of ways kind of emerged from Henry Kissinger's diplomacy during and after the 1973 war, where the United States, Israel, and the sort of principal Arab states are in a kind of have a kind of an arrangement. And then that tightened when the Shah of Iran fell, and Iran became openly hostile to this, working with those countries to kind of defend the Middle East from Iranian expansionism and religious jihadism on the Iranians' part, became this, settled the architecture of the Middle East in a way. Now a lot of water passes under the bridge from the 1970s under today, but that still is the basic architecture of the Middle East. What Biden wants to do, has wanted to do, is water down America's commitments and responsibilities in the Middle East. And there's some good reasons for that. It's not like the Iraq War was a glorious success, or that 50 years of American leadership in the region have made us beloved of the people or turned it into a region of either flourishing economies or flourishing democracies. This is not a place where you can point to all of these happy, clappy successes of American foreign policy. Point taken. But if you are serious about less American involvement and commitment to the Middle East, you have to understand you're not going to have much influence over what comes next. That if the Israelis thought that America was actually going to deal with Iran, an American president could really have a very serious talk with the Israeli prime minister, say about the Palestinians, and say, you give me what I want on the West Bank, and I'll give you what you want on Iran. Because the dialogue right now is, you give me what I want on Iran, which is don't do very much and don't do anything that would embarrass me. And then you can do what I want you to do on the West Bank. And, unless you're going to exercise tremendous amounts of coercive power, and I mean tremendous amounts, maybe even more than the United States has over Israel, you're not going to get very far with that approach. Because it's not a question of diplomacy versus military, but political realism versus illusion. And in the same way, Iran is not going to tell Hezbollah to step down and turn off the rocket attacks on Israel's north if Iran thinks that the United States is basically just trying to step quietly away and that the danger of American intervention is falling over time. If that's what they think, they're going to make their own decisions without any reference to what we want. Now, you can make a case, well, maybe the Middle East would be better off that way. People can argue that. But what the Biden people have been doing is they've been trying to hold on to the kind of architecture that depends on strong American commitment and power projection, even as they undermine the pillars that support it. That is probably a no-win solution, no-win approach. It certainly hasn't produced wins for them. And it ends up, I think, as you see now, they're getting attacked from the left because they really haven't been able to do much to soften Israel's attacks on Gaza. They're getting attacked on the right because in their attempt to get Israel to soften its attacks on the Palestinians in Gaza, they haven't given Israel everything that the Israelis wanted. So what they're in a sour spot. They get attacked from the left for not being effective. They get attacked from the right for not being effective. And they're not effective at getting what they want. So this is not a wise route to go down, but it's the one they've chosen.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. This week, Walter, give us your favorite book about diplomacy that is not Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy. Another option.
Well, a book that I read, back in the 10th grade, or in the benighted school where I went to, we call the fifth form, was this book, The Struggle for Mastery in Europe. I think 1848 to 1917 or something like that. I forget the dates, by A.J.P. Taylor. And this was old-fashioned diplomatic history. This is this foreign minister writing a diplomatic note to that foreign minister to resolve a crisis in some place you've never heard of. And it goes on and on and on. But for me, it kind of kindled an interest in this sort of history and in trying to understand how power works. And as you read this book, you see that a lot of the crises that people thought were tremendously important at the time, even a year or two later, no one cared anything about it at all. You often find that the diplomats on every side were fundamentally mistaken about the issues at stake and about what would happen if X or Y took place. So I think, and some of these are, diplomats with great reputations to this day, like people like Bismarck. So this book is a good introduction to how diplomacy, at least at that time and in that place, worked. And if you find that if you pick up this book and you start to read and you think, this is interesting, that may be a sign that this is a field that you really want to get deeper in.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.